Right, so good afternoon, everyone. As you're starting to join, we'll just wait a minute or two for the rest of the participants, or I should say the audience members, to join us, and we'll get started in just a minute. Those of you just joining us, we're letting the rest of the audience members in, and we'll get started here in just a moment. Adela, you can tell me when we're ready to begin.
I think we can start.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Nicole Santiago. I'm a research manager at Trilateral Research, which is one of the partner organizations in the Co-Create project. And it is my real pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon to this seminar on what is arguably one of the most controversial areas of climate policy at the moment, solar radiation modification, also known as SRM. So this term refers to a set of climate intervention techniques that aim to limit global warming by reducing the amount of sunlight that reaches our planet. It could potentially help reduce some of the impacts of climate change, but of course it also comes with considerable uncertainties and risks, physical, legal, which is what my area of expertise is in, social, political, and of course very relevant for our discussion today, ethical risks. So it's in this context that there is a real growing debate on SRM research and trying to reduce those uncertainties and lower the probability of problematic outcomes. We've seen a lot of those very ongoing debates, as evidenced even yesterday in the Petitions Committee at the UK House of Commons. So at the same time that all of these debates are happening, we can kind of clearly see that our current governance systems really are not informed or ready to inform these decisions about whether and to what extent and under what circumstances SRM research and potential experimentation may be warranted from a scientific or societal viewpoint. So this, of course, is where our project, the Co-Create project, comes in. We are a 3-year funded program by the project by the European Union, and we're seeking to help address the very questions through a very interdisciplinary assessment of the scientific, ethical, and governance considerations of SRM research. So we aim to support decisions on whether or not and under what circumstances SRM research and experiments may be warranted from both a scientific and societal view. With us today, we have Bennett Francis and his colleague Dominique Lenzi, who's, I believe, joining from the audience. We're both from the University of Twente, partners in the Co-Create project that have been focusing mainly on the research ethics questions. So they will present some of their findings and insights. And then we're also delighted to have an independent view from Holly J. Buck from the University of Buffalo, who will be providing her own expert reflections. As you can see from the screen there on our agenda, we'll invite our speakers to speak for the next about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll be opening up the floor for all of our seminar participants for an open discussion. So Bennett, I will hand the floor over to you to start.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Can you all hear me?
You sound good, yes.
Great. So this is a paper which grows out a review conducted under the ethics analysis of Co-Create. And if I could have the next slide, please. And the next slide, please. Great. So we were reviewing, on the one hand, a recent series of high-level authoritative reports on SRM research policy from major science policy institutions in the US and in Europe, as well as international institutions. And then on the other hand, we were reviewing ethics literature relevant to the question of SRM research governance in particular. And yeah, our focus is on research rather than any potential deployment at this stage. So our key starting points here were the US National Academy of Sciences report, which represented a major contribution to the question of research governance, and the report of the EU's scientific advice mechanism just before Christmas, which effectively represented Europe's response to the US position. So we are a European project, and so we wanted to contribute to and build on that European response. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, I'm going to briefly highlight the way legitimacy is raised as a key concern in this recent authoritative literature. I'm going to then set out a conception of legitimacy which draws on some key ethics literature. And then on that basis, I'm going to draw some implications for SRM research governance, namely that stakeholder participation at the level of decision making on research policy is a criterion of legitimacy for institutions directing policy, and that this participation should instantiate justice as recognition. And I'll say a bit more what I mean by that. Next slide, please. So legitimacy has for a long time been discussed, especially in relation to potential deployment. However, in these recent reports, what we see is the question of legitimacy raised in relation to research itself. So just to briefly run through some examples, on the US side, in the NASM report, we've got calls for transdisciplinarity and research governance structures that build trust and legitimacy. Next slide, please. And on the EU side, we've got the SAPIA report, noting that, for example, concern for legitimacy in research governance could be a means to address concerns about elite capture. And SAPIA also identifies legitimacy as one of the main categories of ethical concern in relation to deployment and research, along with distributive justice and procedural justice. So given this continued prominence for legitimacy and the variety of contexts in which it's invoked, it's worth getting clear on what the attribution of legitimacy requires in these contexts. And what we want to do is defend a particular view of legitimacy here, not necessarily to the exclusion of other views, but as a call for it not to get lost in the debate. Next slide, please. So in the ethics literature, legitimacy is typically understood under a normative rather than a descriptive conception, meaning that legitimacy is about whether the object of assessment conforms to certain norms or standards, rather than being about the extent to which the object of assessment is actually regarded as having the right to act as it does by the people its actions affect. It's typically understood as a property of institutions rather than, for example, particular interventions. And rather than having a merely instrumental function of mitigating backlash, is regarded as having a normative function. So, and so an influential theory of that function is the idea that legitimacy assessments serve a meta-coordination role. So I will have to say briefly what I mean by meta-coordination. I'll then go on to argue that applying this view in the context of SRM research has implications for SRM research governance, and that these have not been fully spelled out in the existing literature. So if I could have the next slide, please. The meta-coordination view is the idea that to say that an institution is legitimate is to say that it's worthy of our support through moral reasons, because the benefits of empowering it via that support outweigh the risks of doing so. The function of public institutions in general is to coordinate collective action, and thus the practice of legitimacy assessment serves to address a meta-coordination problem by promoting institutional structures that are conducive to the resolution of coordination problems. So this has two important implications. First, the scope of legitimacy criteria is defined by the scope of the collective action problem the institution under assessment is seeking to address. And second, the interpretation of legitimacy criteria is determined by the context in which the institution operates. Next slide, please. So in the paper, we look at some existing accounts that apply this view to derive assessment criteria for legitimacy, and a basic list involves these 5 conditions. And we're focusing on the final 2, substantive and procedural justice. So the authors that we discuss in the existing literature argue that fulfilling these criteria may or perhaps must involve stakeholder participation of some kind, but the justification for these requirements and thus their scope remained under theorized. So what we want to do in this paper is put some more theoretical flesh on these bones. Next slide, please. Okay, so recalling that a meta-coordination view defines the scope of legitimacy conditions by the scope of the collective action problem institutions are supposed to solve. Institutions directing SRM research in the context of something like the EU's research architecture are doing so in the context of a wider research program addressing climate action. So effectively then, international climate action is the collective action problem to be addressed by the relevant research policy institutions for the purposes of legitimacy assessment. And second, recall that the interpretation of legitimacy criteria is to be determined by institutional context. So here, determining that an institution represents a clear benefit and is thus potentially legitimate involves meeting the standards established in the context of international climate action. So we argue that this involves ensuring that the globally vulnerable to climate change are given voice and are empowered to participate in decision making on terms of parity. In other words, this is a conception of justice termed recognition. Next slide, please. So just to say why we think it is this recognition conception that is the appropriate standard for substantive justice. The case is twofold. First, in the political practice of climate action, major interventions are viewed under the frame of global power imbalances. So the fear on the part of the globally marginalized that any change will recapitulate and intensify these imbalances is perhaps the major political dividing line in climate action. And this fear is reflected, for instance, in public attitude surveys, such as the one quoted here. Now, recognition justice, with its focus on social parity and participation, precisely reflects these concerns. Second, in the institutional practice related to climate action, there are some indications that participatory requirements appeal to recognition. So, for example, the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights has noted that a wide, inclusive, and decolonized understanding of science is an important way to fulfill the right to participate in science. And she also notes the right includes the right to participate in decision-making, and that democratic control does not mean state control. So if I could have the next slide, please. So just finally then, I wanted to note that all this serves to reinforce a principle that is proposed by the American Geophysical Union under their ethical framework for climate intervention research, that the decision to pursue research and thus decision-making on research policy should be subject to stakeholder participation requirements. And it's at this level of research policy direction rather than at the level of particular research projects that legitimacy conditions should be met. So that's all from me for now, but I look forward to the questions later.
Absolutely spot on time, Bennett. Pretty impressive there. So I will turn the floor over to Holly Buck, who is Associate Professor for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Buffalo. Holly, are you
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me to engage with this paper. I have to confess, I'm not sure I'm the best discussant just because, I'm not trained in ethics or philosophy. I've worked enough with ethicists to know that my brain works a little bit differently than people trained in those fields. So on one hand, I may be missing important points. On the other hand, I may be reading and engaging with this work in the way that a lot of people might. So maybe there's something useful there. Um, I'm a sociologist by training, so I was very interested in this concept of legitimacy. You're very clear to distinguish this descriptive or sociological or sense of legitimacy, also called perceived legitimacy, which is really just about whether society views and perceives an institution as having authority, and gets along with that institution, and the normative sense of legitimacy, which refers to whether an institution is worthy of support according to a set of standards, which is the focus of your work, as I understand it. And I was just wondering if maybe you could talk more about how those two concepts interact with each other, or what your analysis of the institutional can tell us about how we think about the descriptive sense. Just, I think a lot of people, when they hear about legitimacy, their go-to mental model will be this sociological sense, rather than this other sense that you're discussing. And I think that there's a few things I thought about while reading, that are going to be common points that other people will think about. So one is the issue of scale, and at what scale some of this research has these demands around recognition, justice, and legitimacy. The paper discusses how, in the view of some people, open air experimentation on a scale large enough to cause a measurable change in regional climate would effectively be human subject research, because it could materially affect human populations in these regions. And so I do think there may be some scalar dimension that would be worth discussing more. I was also thinking about, obviously, the issue about context and the fact that we're currently doing all of these things that are impacting climates. And I think a lot of people, when they engage with the ethics literature, are coming from this perspective of, oh, well, the world is already so profoundly unethical. Our, lives are impacted by fossil fuel companies and others that are currently doing things. So why does geoengineering have this special burden to act in accordance with these principles when the world is already so screwed up? So I do think that if we were going to start suddenly living in this better world where people are acting ethically with regards to the consent of others, we wouldn't even need to be talking about geoengineering, because we would be addressing the issue of putting CO2 into the atmosphere. So I think sometimes the relevance of this work can seem detached to people that are living in this non-ideal reality. And then the final thing I was thinking about is just this powerful idea of recognition justice that you focus on in the latter part of the paper. And you talk about how taking a recognition lens to research governance would also require a different approach to knowledge production and the science policy interface. And I think it would be so valuable for the community to do more to flesh out what this would look like in practice. Maybe that's another step that you do in collaboration as this project and your work proceeds. But I was really thinking about how we operationalize these concerns from a very practical standpoint. I think that there's a couple operational problems with participation. There's one form where, if you conceive of participation as anybody who opts into participating, you can get flooded with people who are acting under the influence of misinformation, who are motivated by beliefs around chemtrails, or we've seen how the anti-vaccine movement, with its emphasis on informed consent, is creeping into geoengineering. And you might have outcomes from that process that aren't useful. Essentially, you might be having governance by the misinformed. So there's a consideration there. You also have the issue of having professionals that are purporting to speak for underrepresented groups as their source of income, and they haven't been elected by those groups. So there's questions of representation that come in from those forms of participation. And then a final practical challenge is that if you want to prioritize engagement with marginalized groups or misrecognized groups, this paper raises this question of how to do that. I think that they may either be too busy or they may be over-researched in the real world. Many groups are either experiencing research fatigue from researchers consulting them on a whole variety of climate topics and topics beyond climate, or they may not see the value in participating in research governance or research consultation. So I think these things speak to a new approach for participation, and I'm wondering if there's dimensions of your work in the ethical space that can inform people who are eventually going to be trying to translate these recommendations into practical actions that require budgets and timetables and all the rest of it. So I'll leave off there. Those are just my first thoughts with the paper, and I look forward to seeing how this work evolves.
Maybe I could just quickly say, you mentioned at the beginning there that you're not trained as an ethicist and don't know if you're the best place for this, but I have to say those are really fantastic insights and questions. And I want to sort of emphasize before I turn it back over to Bennett to respond to some of these, that really is sort of the core of this Co-Create project, is that we are taking a very co-disciplinary approach, so that these types of exchanges can happen and be hopefully very, very fruitful and come out with some outcomes that are in fact informed by all of our different expertise. So with that in mind, thank you very much for joining us, Holly. And Bennett, would you like to begin by responding?
Yeah, let me echo what Nicole said. Despite your modesty, some very important and incisive questions. I think I'll take them sort of in reverse order. So just on this final point about, how can we really operationalize this concern for recognition in actual political processes, and how do we avoid a number of ways in which those can be kind of distorted by not exactly bad actors, but actors exerting influence in potentially problematic ways. And I would say that this contribution does operate at a very quite a high level, and it's firstly making the point that it's making a point about where participation should take place, and at what form participation should take in general terms. It's only one output of our ethics analysis under Co-Create. And another area that we're looking at very closely is the relationship between research in the European Union context and research in the Arctic context. And we certainly think that it should be that we want to draw distinctions between research that has a global relevance from research that can be limited to a more local focus. So this also speaks to your second question when you were discussing, how can we draw links between participation and considerations of scale, right? I think where it's possible to frame interventions as benefiting local communities, this is one way of, creating an immediate kind of entry point for fruitful participation, because as you say, there's a danger that participants are motivated by kind of potentially special interests. But one of the takeaways of this research should be that if we're going to conduct these kinds of participatory exercises, we have to be very clear about what function it is that they're serving. And if they're serving a legitimation function, one way in which they can do that is through this idea that research can be a co-creative exercise between local participants and non-local participants, which comes to some kind of mutually beneficial conclusion. So that has that kind of way of reasoning has a political dimension, and it has a kind of purely scientific dimension. So thank you for calling for us to bring that out further, and we do intend to do that in our other areas of our work. The other thing that you asked about was this question of, well, given that the world is so unethical, why should we hold SRM to apparently especially high ethical standards? And I think that this is an important question, but I think that on the one hand, SRM isn't special, and that is in a way the argument that we're making, in that it would be we're calling for standards of legitimacy to be applied consistently across institutions and the assessment of institutions. But where SRM is special is, I guess, its place in history and the development of technologies as they currently stand. So it would be lovely if we could subject fossil fuel companies to legitimacy assessment for their actions that they take in the public domain. Unfortunately, these organizations operate to a large extent outside of public collective control. Research within the context of, for example, the European Union, fortunately, does not operate outside the context of public collective control. And we're also at a historical moment where our theoretical understanding of SRM techniques are reasonably well developed, but from a technology development perspective, many of these kinds of interventions are still considered to be at a relatively low level of technological readiness, which means that we have at the present moment the opportunity to intervene to ensure alignment with societal values, which is a moment which has already passed us by with respect to a number of other technology fields. So in a way, the specialness of SRM is a question of opportunity, but it's not a question of applying special standards to SRM. That's the way that we're approaching it for the purposes of this paper, at least. And then finally, the question of why focus on or why focus on normative legitimacy, or how to make questions of normative legitimacy more relevant to, for example, social scientists and people outside of a kind of ethics domain. I think the one one component of the meta-coordination view of legitimacy is precisely that it is bridging this divide, as it were, between normative legitimacy and descriptive or sociological legitimacy, because it's saying it's essentially providing reasons for why we should approve of institutions. So where a sociological conception of legitimacy approaches the question from the perspective of whether the facts on the ground about whether we approve of certain institutions. A meta-coordination view kind of fleshes this out by providing parameters for reasoning about why we should support institutions, why we do support institutions, and it's linking it back to a conception of enlightened self-interest. Essentially, it's saying we should support institutions insofar as they are uniquely well positioned to solve the collective action problems that we are assigning them and are trying to solve in all of our best interests. So the two ideas should overlap as far as possible. If we've got good reasons to approve of institutions, then hopefully people will also approve of those institutions. And the more people are aware of the fact that we have good reasons to support those institutions, the more people will support those institutions. But as I say, thank you very much for those questions. I'm sure I haven't answered them entirely to your satisfaction, but at least that will get us started for the purposes of this discussion. Thank you very much.
I think we can probably open up the discussion for questions from the audience as well. And Adela, I don't know if you want to put some of our rules for engagement into the chat, just to remind us all of how we'll sort of move forward here with this discussion. So do feel free to put your questions in as a comment, and I will read them out. And then perhaps if it's not totally clear to me exactly what you were asking, I might invite you to jump in and just clarify. We do have a first question here coming from Jeff, who's asking, isn't SRM, by whatever methodology, best being realized in a safer time frame if we preach the, quote, moral hazard of avoiding it makes climate mitigation worse? So I suppose that also sort of begs the question, how do we deal with legitimacy when we have very different, potentially very different opinions from the stakeholder groups that are considering the information and coming to very different conclusions about whether or not and how we should be engaging in SRM? So what can some of the research you've seen so far help us deal with these questions of very conflicting narratives? I suppose in many ways it goes also to the last question from Holly, which is the operationalization. We can talk about all of these questions, but how do we really end up reconciling some of these different views?
Yes. Okay. So the idea of there being a moral hazard of associated with promoting the idea that SRM should be a subject of special concern, I guess you could say, is the thought is perhaps that that itself is creating potential dangers. I think that may be the case, but nevertheless, from the perspective of an institutional setup like the European Union that is in the business of deciding where to invest research funds, it's incumbent upon them, as I have tried to say, to pursue social alignment of their policy with their citizen base and with people in wider society more generally. So I think that the questioner makes a good point that we do have to take this kind of like this form of moral hazard, which is the inverse of the moral hazard that is generally discussed in these in these discussions, into account. And we do have to balance the risk associated with placing undue limitations on the ability to progress with research. But that has to be done in a politically negotiated context and in a politically negotiated way. And I think what we hope to do in this project is to show that that can be done, and it isn't a question of simply do we limit or do we let rip. It's finding it's finding the right institutional structures in which to carry out research.
I might follow up with kind of my own question then, and I know that this is something that we're looking at in the Co-Create project and don't have any final recommendations yet, although that will be something that comes out at the end. Sort of from your perspective, Bennett, and Holly, please feel free to come in as well.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at the European Union and the European institutions, how do you feel like this concept of legitimacy can be pursued? How can we actually see some of these sort of high-level principles be operationalized?
So I think this is a subject for further research, but one thing I would note is that for example, in the recent reports from the EU Scientific Advice Mechanism, one of the proposals which is advanced is the idea of citizen assemblies, and I think it's if this is something which is to be pursued, I would stress this point that the function that these citizen assemblies are intended to serve ought to be very clearly defined if they are to have any success. And that's not to say that they have to serve one function. It could be a range of functions, but those functions do need to be defined in advance. And one of them, I think, could be securing legitimacy for research activities under a political conception. Yeah, but also, Holly, if this is something that you wanted to come in on, please do. But
I could comment later, but I saw there's a question from Dana that looks interesting.
Okay.
I think interesting and actually very relevant because it's sort of a follow-up to this, sort of looking at the current context where we have ethical guidelines from like the AGU and the Royal Society, and commenting that, is this a question of self-determination from and for the research community? And if that is true, then do these research frameworks somehow diminish the role of states? And asking then kind of finally as a follow-up, shouldn't we also look at legislation and the precautionary principle? And I will quickly answer the last question by saying yes, and we are. We have a whole set of work in the Co-Create project that's actually led by Trilateral. One of my colleagues is also on the call here today, where we are looking at legislation and the precautionary principle. So all of these sort of complementary frameworks that we believe will need to work together. But yeah, Ben, I don't know if you want to comment at all, or and Holly as well, on this idea of these ethical frameworks that are being developed for and by research communities. What role do they have to play?
Yes, so isn't this self-determination from and for the research community at the same time? So I think that so frameworks like the AGU, which are essentially voluntary standards to which research organizations can adhere, and uh, certainly play a role in parallel to the role of states and the role of legislation. I think that they're especially important in during a period when this is underregulated. But I think the presence of these standards shouldn't mean that we shouldn't be also opening up the discussion to the role of state policy and union policy. And as far as as far as I understand it, one can learn from the other. And but I think it's important that these standards do have the backing of political organizations behind them where possible. But so I don't see any, so to your question, I don't see necessarily any tension there. But maybe I'm not fully capturing the tension that you're trying to bring out in the question.
Maybe I'll just footnote something briefly. I think that these frameworks can have an important pedagogical function. I think if you're an early career scholar trying to navigate all of this, it's useful to have something to guide you and let you know if you're going in the right direction. And so I see it as complementary, not a substitute for things that states might do.
I think I would agree as well
so.
from kind of the legal perspective that it gives you insight into the scientific technical experts and what they feel is necessary and possible, of course, informs then the eventual legal discussions. But of course, sometimes those legal discussions take much longer, not always, but often. And so it is a complementary process, I think, or it can be a complementary process. So we have another comment in here, sort of just making some points and some statements about whether or not the technology or the science is as well understood as we may say or believe it is, and pointing out the significant or the potentially significant scientific uncertainties that still need to be addressed. And one of the final question here is wondering if we as a project are addressing the issue of applying different requirements for different scales of outdoor experiments. And I can say that the answer is yes. Bennett, you can say some more too if you want. One of our kind of like initial questions as a project is definitions related. So how are we defining SRM? How are we defining research? And then how are we defining the different sort of how we break up SRM. So in terms of SRM research, what is large scale? What is small scale? Is that a useful terminology to be using? Do we want this in a binary? Do we want it more on a scale? So these are all things that we hope we're not taking any of these terms for granted and really unpacking what they really mean to see if they are in fact going to serve us well moving forward for a governance structure that is in fact informed by all of these ethical, social, and legal governance questions. Bennett, do you want to say any more there?
No, I think you've covered that pretty well. The other question was on the point of saying that the sciences, or pointing out that I may have said that the science is pretty well understood with respect to SRM. I don't think that if I think I would happily retract that if that's what I said. I think I was drawing a distinction there between the idea of if you view this field as a technology development field, and maybe that is tendentious. I accept that it is, but if you view it as something of that kind, then it's quite interesting in that there is a very large body of or a comparatively large body, I should say, sorry, of theoretical work, where in comparison to a much smaller body of work on technology development. But that's not to say that the science is pretty well understood and that the only kind of important, interesting questions in relation to legitimacy are about technology development. So I fully take your point there.
So the next question that you can answer very quickly is whether the paper that has been discussed here is available. It is still in manuscript form, is that correct? So not yet publicly available?
Yep, it's still under review, but we will be putting it out through co-create channels as soon as we can.
All right. The next question being, why is the IPCC so lame on SRM? I don't think we can purport to speak on behalf of IPCC and their approach on this, other than to say that, I mean, our project exists because there is so much controversy around the technology, and recognizing that controversy comes from so many different sides. So, we will do our best to offer a bit of clarity in the midst of some of the very robust debates. But however, the IPCC, moves forward with their discussions is a little bit outside of our hands or the topic at hand today. The next question is a kind of a clarification from Dana here, asking about the ethical frameworks. So just to point out the gap that ethical frameworks leave or hide, talking about the SAPIA report mentions the importance of a moratorium, which would mean that only the states will decide on admissibility of SRM activities and field experiments. But then other frameworks seem to assume that adhering to some principles will be sufficient to start SRM field experiments. So I think this is sort of pointing to the fact that there is, again, obviously disagreement between different parties and different actors on how to move forward with this. I mean, it's something that we are tracking in the project and obviously very aware of all of these developments. Bennett, do you want to say anything in particular on sort of how to reconcile different quote unquote ethical frameworks and how you are sort of approaching looking at those different frameworks in your work?
Yeah, so in this particular paper, yeah, we don't address the question of a moratorium, but I don't want to weigh in it directly. But what I would say is that I think that the differences between the documents is significant in that I think what the context in which research is taking place has implications for the extent to which it can be regarded as legitimate. So if research is being done as part of a well-regulated research program, that will improve the extent to which it can be attributed with legitimacy. And if it's being done outside of that context, it will, that will count as a potential legitimacy deficit, and a legitimacy can provide a parameter for reasoning that is critical of those contexts. But yeah, the question of the moratorium is not something that we're looking at directly here. In this paper, but in co-create more broadly, I should say that we are, of course, tracking, as Nicole said.
So we have about 5 minutes left or so. Holly, I just wanted to see, as our kind of special guest today, if there's any other thoughts that you wanted to add or respond back to any of Bennett's comments to your questions.
The thing that I'm still struggling with is this relationship between the sociological and the institutional legitimacy. Because from a sociological standpoint, people can have almost completely opposite views. I'm thinking about Trump's comments this morning, which are worth watching this clip if you haven't seen it, where he says, regarding Israel and Iran, we basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the F they're doing. And he's very upset, he's very direct. And for one portion of the US population, his legitimacy comes from being able to say things like that. And for the other part of the population, it's like, how could you have a statesperson and leader that's going to behave in that way? So it's almost like two conflicting opinions, where on one hand he's legitimate because of that behavior, and the other hand he's totally illegitimate because of that behavior. And if you have this divergence with the sociological legitimacy, like, can you find an institutional legitimacy that's coherent, or is it always going to have to address these different conceptions sociologically? That's what I'm curious about. I don't expect that we'll answer it right away, but I think it's interesting and a challenge for this topic for sure.
But for me, I would just say that this kind of illustrates why it is important to think about normative conceptions of legitimacy, because there are lots of institutions which are well established, and people do not consider their legitimacy because they take them as kind of background conditions of their action. But it's only when we have either a new institution or an institution is applied in a new domain that people might begin to question legitimacy, or the legitimacy of institutions becomes a topic of political debate. And when it becomes a topic of political debate, that's when we need normative parameters for reasoning about legitimacy to structure that debate. So that if somebody says, I don't believe that this institution is acting legitimacy, we're not just falling back on, well, subset of the population A thinks this, subset of the population B thinks this. We can progress with the discussion and give reasons as to why people should be persuaded to our view. But yeah, but maybe that's, yeah, but yeah, I don't know. Still an ethicist's way of looking at things, but I still think that it shows that there is a place for this way of thinking.
As we get ready to close, Bennett, maybe you can just say a couple final words on sort of next steps for the ethical work in the project. Obviously, there'll be the publication of this manuscript, and then I know there's a few other threads that you'll be pulling together on the ethical perspectives here of SRM.
Yeah, so the next big piece of work that we are working on is specifically a comparison between participatory requirements in at this same high level of the research of these standards that are discussed in this paper, and placed alongside the requirements for research ethics and research governance, which are specific to the Arctic context, because we think that in some ways the discussions in the Arctic context here are more advanced and go deeper. So we think that there's the potential there for kind of learning in both directions. So that would be the next output of the ethics analysis, and then all the components of the ethics analysis will be feeding into Co-Create's wider work of updating guidelines for research.
And of course, that's in addition to work on the legal frameworks, on the policy discussions, on the scientific technical dimensions. So it's a very robust project. We hope this has whetted your appetite to join us for many more future seminars as well. Holly, I want to thank you very much for joining us today, for coming in as our external expert and really providing some incredibly valuable feedback and insight into these really challenging questions. And Bennett, thank you for tackling all these questions today. To everyone in the audience, if you do want to learn more about the Co-Create project and the work that we've been doing, of course, we have our website, so the cocreateproject.eu. There's also information about joining the stakeholder forum if you're interested in being even more involved. You can also follow the project's updates on LinkedIn and keep up with basically all of the work that we're doing via our newsletter. And actually, I believe that Adela with Climate Strategies is dropping a bunch of links and perhaps a QR, oh, I see it now, the QR code up on the screen if you want to follow us and get more involved. So I thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I believe we will close this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.